Welcome back to the Imperfectionist podcast. My name is David Rendell, and I'm excited to start this episode like we normally do with a question, which is this: Are you in your element? Now, what do I mean by that? We have different phrases for that, like when you're in a state of flow, when you're in the zone, when you're doing what you love and you're doing it well. Are you in your element when you go to work, specifically in your career? Do you spend a significant amount of time in your element when you get ready to go to work, when you're doing the work that you need to do? Do you feel like you're in your element, right? If an animal all animals have a certain habitat, right? Polar bears live up in the Arctic in the snow and on the ice, and um, chameleons live in the jungle and in the rainforest, and prairie dogs live underground. Animals have a habitat and they thrive when they're in that habitat. People thrive when they're in their element. And the two primary um, aspects of the element, two primary conditions of being in your element is, are you doing what you love? You genuinely like it. You would do it maybe even if you didn't get paid for it. Sometimes you do activities like this without being paid for it on your own because you love it, but you're also good at it, right? We all know people who love something and aren't very good at it, and we have to endure it and try to be nice. And so both are crucial. This isn't just doing something that you like. Some people like to golf, even though they're really bad at it. That's not being in your element. Being in your element is you like it and you're good at it. So are you in your element? You might say, well, nobody could be in their element all the time, and that's fine. What percentage of time do you feel like you're spending in your element? One of the reasons, and I've mentioned this before, one of the reasons that I do this podcast is because speaking, communicating verbally is in my element. I would rather not sit down and write for an hour, but I'm happy to sit down and talk for an hour. And so that's the question for today. Are you in your element? If you're not, would you like to be? Right? Would you like to get into your element? If so, that's what this episode is about. If you are, to some extent, but you'd like to go even farther and be even more in your element than you currently are, this episode is for you as well. And I'm sure we can all refine it. I doubt there's very many people. I feel like I'm pretty close to in my element, but I'm sure I could always get better. So we always start with a question and then we start with a quote. And our quote today is from Sir Ken Robinson, who wrote a book called The Element, right? The subtitle is How Finding Your Passion Changes Everything. I just reread this. I listened to it initially, I think on audiobook, or I might have read it on my Kindle back in the day. But I use one of Ken Robinson's quotes in every single one of my Freak Factor speeches. And what he says is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. Now, we're going to break that quote down quite a bit more than we normally do because I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And we're going to focus on Ken Robinson's book today, and we're going to tie it into the Imperfectionist podcast, because you'd almost think, well, being in your element means sort of, perfecting things or being perfect. And it is, in a way, it's being the perfect person for that situation. We talked about that in the first episode when we talked about Rudolph, accepting and appreciating who we are with our imperfections, but then also aligning those characteristics with a situation that minimizes the weakness, that puts the weakness in the shadow and maximizes the strength, puts a spotlight on our strengths. So let's break down that quote. Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not. So that might have been one of your first reactions. Dave, there's nothing valuable that I love. I love watching Netflix, or I love, cracking a six pack on the back deck, or I love, taking naps. So you might immediately say, like, I don't have brilliance, talent, creativity. I don't have anything that I love to do that's valuable enough, or I'm not good enough at any particular thing for me to really ever be in my element. That's not really a reality for me. And that's how that quote starts. Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not. Well, why? Right? Because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. In other words, you had something that you loved and that you were good at. You had a strength, you had an ability, you had a passion. But in school, and that's a significant part of our life, and it's not just a school problem, it also happens at home, it also happens at work, and it could have happened at all three of those places or at one very specifically. But many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. Their teachers, the principal, the superintendents, the other students said, not only is that not a good thing, not only is that not a strength, it might actually be a weakness, or, and this is oftentimes likely, it was just ignored, right? Nobody really paid any attention to it. Nobody got excited about it. Nobody encouraged it. People just acted like there was nothing really there. Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not. And here's the thing with that quote. Think is in the present tense. I always add still, right? Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people still think they're not. This isn't thought they weren't. This isn't they've realized now. The quote assumes that people still think they're not talented, brilliant, and creative because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. This continues on 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old. The talent, the brilliance, creativity is still invisible potentially to some of us because it wasn't valued explicitly by anyone. No one encouraged us, no one supported us, no one said go farther with that, or people said stop that. That's no good. That's not going to work out for you. That's not valuable. That's not brilliance. That's not talent. That's not creativity. That's some kind of problem. That's some kind of weakness. And that's why we call this the Imperfectionist Podcast, because we live in a world that identifies our strengths as weaknesses, identifies the best things about us oftentimes as the worst things about us, identifies our brilliance, talent, creativity as a problem to be solved instead of as something incredibly valuable to be embraced. And that's part of what I'm trying to undo with my speeches, but also with this podcast, is show you that maybe you're more brilliant, more talented, and more creative than you thought you were, than you think you are, and to show you that those things that were sometimes stigmatized are actually the best things about you. Now, again, we're not here to pick on school. This isn't the only place that it happens. When I was a kid, my parents called me motor mouth at home to remind me that I needed to stop talking so much. Our brilliance, talent, and creativity gets ignored and stigmatized at home as well. We've certainly, almost every person listening to this podcast or watching this podcast has worked in a situation where you thought you were bringing your strengths to work. You thought you were bringing your best to work. You thought you were showing brilliance, talent, creativity, at least at some level, and the people around you didn't see it. Your boss criticized you for it. In the book, I talk about a person who was really calm and their boss criticized them on a performance review for having an eerie sense of calm. Somebody else was very positive, and her boss said that if people want sunshine, they can go outside. Those people were bringing their best to work, and yet their boss, their employer, their manager didn't see it. Our parents oftentimes don't see it. And not only, this is crucial, not only do they not see the upside, they see it as a downside. They don't just say, don't go farther with that. They say, stop that completely, eliminate that. That's why my assessment's called the Amplify assessment, because so often we get the advice to moderate, reduce, and eliminate characteristics that we have that are valuable, but other people don't see them as valuable. So many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And I think that's one of the biggest things that keeps us from being in our element, keeps you from being in your element, is that you don't know that you have one, that you don't know that you have anything that you're passionate enough about and good enough at to qualify. And then if you do, you might not think it's realistic to pursue that. You know, they call it work for a reason. If you liked it, it wouldn't be work. It's unrealistic to think you can do what you love for a living. That's not really the way most people live their lives. You do that with hobbies in your off time, whatever those beliefs happen to be. So I want to tell you some stories today and give you some examples of people who found their element specifically by discovering talent, brilliance, and creativity hiding inside of what seemed like a negative, what seemed like a weakness. So, our book for the week is The Element by Ken Robinson, How Finding Your Passion Changes Everything. He's also written follow-up books to this book. I think this one came out in 2000. The paperback came out in 2009. He's got another follow-up book called Finding Your Element. His TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity, is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. I would encourage you to check that out. He also has another TED Talk as well. And so that's kind of our focus today. And so I wanted to start with a school story. So there's a kid named Joe Whale. He lives in England. He lives in the United Kingdom. I think specifically in England. That's complicated if you want to look it up. What's Britain? What's the United Kingdom? What's England? But I think he lives in England. And he was in school. And he was a little kid, 9, 10 years old, and he loved to doodle. Now, I'm not just talking like scribble. He liked to make intricate, sort of complicated, artistic drawings on paper. He loved to doodle. And he would fill up notebook page after notebook page after notebook page with these doodles, but he was supposed to be in school, right? He was supposed to be focused on his schoolwork. He was supposed to be focused on what the teacher had to say. And so in one of his classes, one of his teachers very specifically sat him down and said, Joe, you need to stop this, right? You need to stop this. You can't be doodling in class. You need to focus on what I'm saying. You need to focus on what we're learning. You need to focus on schoolwork. This is not art class. So let's just stop right there. Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not because the thing they were good at, art, let's just give it the general drawing. The thing they were good at, Joe was good at art, Joe was good at drawing, wasn't valued. She didn't see any value for this skill that he had. She didn't even see it as a skill. She saw it as a distraction and as a problem. It not only wasn't valued, it was actually stigmatized. She said, you've got to stop doing this because this isn't good, because we are in school and this isn't what you're supposed to be doing. So notice that instinct, and that's fair. Let's be fair to teachers. She wasn't teaching art, and it's fair for her to ask a student to pay attention to what she thought was important and to what she was trying to do in that particular situation. So it was fair for her to do that. But as we're going to see, it wasn't helpful to Joe to do that. It wasn't serving Joe. It was serving school. It was serving the environment. It was serving the system that they were in. And that's one of the reasons it's difficult to be a teacher, because if you do want to support people's individual uniqueness, you're oftentimes caught in a structure that isn't really designed to support that individual uniqueness. And there's a tug maybe between what your job is asking you to do and what you might otherwise do in a different situation. So Joe gets the message that this is no good, but he goes to a different class in school, because you move from spot to spot, and a different teacher has a completely different response. And this other teacher says, Joe, I've been seeing your doodling, and these doodles are amazing, and we need to share your doodles with the world. And so her idea is to do that on Instagram. It's free to create an Instagram account, and Instagram is a visual sort of format where people are used to seeing images. And so she helps Joe set up an Instagram account, and he starts posting his doodles on Instagram, and you can find him, I believe, at the Joe Whale. But he became more famous as, I'm looking it up here while we're talking, he becomes more famous as Doodle Boy, right? So he becomes known for, it's the Joe Whale, and whale is like the animal, WHALE, Joe Whale, aka Doodle Boy. Right now he has 184,000 followers. So she gets him on Instagram. People start seeing his doodles. People start liking his doodles. And the first thing that happens is he starts to get some local attention. And so there's this local restaurant, and they decide that they'd love to feature some local art. And let's again focus on Instagram. If your place is very Instagrammable, if you have a cool wall or a cool spot for people to take pictures, or it's just a cool environment, and people can share it, it's likely to attract attention to your establishment. So this restaurant says, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had Joe do some of his art at our restaurant? And so they took a pretty big step, and they painted all of their walls white. And they hired Joe. Now let's notice what just happened. Joe is now getting paid to do the doodles that the teacher told him to stop doing, right? But another teacher told him, hey, I think you've got something special. And notice that teacher also was not teaching art, and was not teaching social media, and was not teaching entrepreneurship. But that teacher saw it as their job to value and encourage, the opposite of not valuing and stigmatizing, value and encourage his brilliance, talent, and creativity. She saw strength where the other teacher saw weakness. She saw something positive where the other teacher saw something negative. She saw something valuable where the other person saw something that was actually counterproductive, or maybe even completely worthless. So now Joe is a child, and he's being paid what a lot of people wish they could be paid. He's being paid to do his art. He isn't just doing a job to get experience. He isn't just doing a job to make some money, to learn how the world works. He's getting paid to do his art, and he's becoming famous, at least locally. And also he's becoming more and more famous internationally, because people are starting to follow him on Instagram and talk about him. Here's this boy who has these amazing doodles. So a lot of things start happening because people notice the doodles at the restaurant, and people start writing about it and talking about it in the media and on social media. He partners with a guy called Mr. Doodle. So there's already a grown man who's famous for his doodles. Mr. Doodle has painted his whole house white on the inside, every surface white, and doodled the entire house. Every wall is full of his doodles, the ceilings, the columns, the everything. So Joe becomes friends with Mr. Doodle, and Mr. Doodle helps him to do his first gallery show. So now people are buying his art, just like you would buy a painting from a famous artist. So now Joe is becoming even more successful with his art. And Joe is then asked to illustrate some books. And so he partners with a children's book author, and he starts illustrating books. And doodles are perfect for books. Also, he creates a doodle coloring book, and doodles are perfect for coloring books because they're black and white, and you can fill them in. So they're perfect for that. Nike finds out about Joe and hires him to do what I believe is a limited edition sneaker. So now Joe is working with the international giant Nike. Again, something that many, many, many artists would aspire to have, that kind of collaboration, that kind of partnership. On his Instagram, it says that he has partnered with the Prince and Princess of Wales. Not a bad collaboration. He's partnered with Pixar. He did his illustrations for books through Scholastic, if you're familiar with the Scholastic book fair. So let's look at what happened there. I think we could all agree that Joe is in his element. Doodle Boy is in his element. It's even become his name. The whole definition of who he was is this thing that he loves and that he's very good at. Joe is in his element, and Joe still isn't working age. Joe still isn't out of school, but I think most people would agree that science class isn't as important as Joe finding his element. I think that maybe math class isn't as important as Joe finding his element. And I think most people would agree that what that one teacher did for Joe by encouraging and supporting and directing his talent, brilliance, and creativity was crucial to that process and potentially made all of this happen. And that's the potential we have. We started asking if you're in your element, but if you're a parent, if you're a leader, if you're an educator, if you care about other people, I'd hope that you're trying to help other people find their element instead of being the kind of person who discourages it, right? I think a good question, would be which teacher do you wish that you would have been, right? Which character do you want to be in the Joe Wales story? How do you want to be remembered, as a person who criticized or ignored or stigmatized other people's talent, brilliance, or creativity, or the person who encouraged that person to embrace it? So Joe, Doodle Boy, has an amazing life and an amazing career, and has even become famous because somebody saw and encouraged his talent and creativity and helped him to find his element, right? Helped him to, I held up the book upside down and backwards if you're watching this on YouTube, helped him to find his element. And that's what I want for you, right? That's what I want for you. So that's one example. And I think there's a lot of great lessons that we can learn from that. Another comes from Ken Robinson's book, The Element. So he starts the book with a story of this little girl named Jillian. And Jillian's in school and she's not doing well. And she's not doing well with the other kids, and she's not doing well with the teachers. And they all kind of decide something's wrong with Jillian. And Jillian's mom is worried that something's wrong with Jillian, because when the kids and the teachers think something's wrong with your kid, then you start to think that something's wrong with your kid, and you don't want your kid to fail. You want your kid to succeed. All of these come from good intentions, right? And so the school encourages her to take Jillian to a psychiatrist and get assessed. So she goes in, and it's this beautiful office, and there's a couch, and Jillian sits on the couch, and the mom sits in a chair by the psychiatrist's desk, and the psychiatrist is asking the mom a bunch of questions, and Jillian's sitting there sort of oblivious, but also a little bit concerned because the conversation doesn't seem super positive. And at one point, the psychiatrist says, let's leave the room. And he tells Jillian, hey, we just need to go talk in the hall for a minute. So I just want you to stay in here. But as he leaves, he turns on some music. Now, this is an older story. I think he actually put on a record. But they leave the room. They leave Jillian in the room by herself, and he turns on some music before he leaves, and he closes the door. Um, and the mom says, "Well, what did you need to talk to me about that we couldn't talk um, in front of Jillian?" And um, he says, "Oh, well, I didn't really want to talk to you. I just wanted you to see this. And I want you to watch what your daughter's doing now that we turned on the music." And Jillian had stood up and had become sort of dancing and moving very fluidly, very naturally, very gracefully throughout the room. Because Jillian needed movement in order to learn. Jillian needed music in order to think, in order to open up, in order to hear sort of what was going on around her. There was something about movement and dance and music that spoke to her. Jillian was in her element when she was dancing, when she was moving, and school didn't allow her to move, much less to dance, and music was certainly not a part of any of it. And so the psychiatrist basically said, "There's nothing wrong with your daughter. She just needs to go to a school that focuses on music and dance." So this is the first, we've talked about this before, the importance of alignment. Joe Whale went from getting in trouble for doodling to partnering with Nike, partnering with Pixar, partnering with Scholastic Books, having his own art featured in a gallery show. Because someone helped him to find the right fit. So most of the time, what we're trying to do is help people fit. Jillian doesn't fit at school. How do we get her to fit at school? And a lot of times the answer is medication. We fix the person, or we change the person, or we moderate the person's symptoms instead of saying, what can we do to help this person succeed? We say that, well, helping this person succeed is helping them to succeed in this environment instead of changing the environment. That's the fundamental message of everything we're ever going to talk about on the Imperfectionist podcast. Is we don't need to change who people are. We need to change where they are. We don't need to change the person. We need to change the place, right? And so what the psychiatrist said is she just needs to go to a school that focuses on dance. And that's what her mom did. Her mom put her in a school that focuses on dance. They still teach the subjects, but they teach them all related to dance and related to movement. And they certainly have a bigger emphasis on those things. They value someone like Jillian, and they don't stigmatize someone like Jillian because they're a school that prioritizes the things that Jillian loved and was good at. And so at the very beginning, the school became a chance for her to get closer to being in her element. In fact, it was when she was at that school, she was in her element. And the ending of that story is that Jillian went on to become a famous choreographer who did the choreography for Broadway shows like Cats and Phantom of the Opera and many, many, many other shows. She found her element because somebody helped her find her element, because somebody didn't try to fix her. They didn't try to fix the weakness. They didn't try to stigmatize her. They didn't try to force her to fit in a situation where she didn't fit. They didn't try to get her to succeed outside of her element. They recognized that she had an element, and that success comes from getting in that element, being in that element, finding those situations, and becoming absorbed into those environments. And that's not always the way it happens. I'm sure a lot of you have stories of that not happening. Most of my childhood was a story of that not happening. And certainly there's limitations there, right? You might be thinking, I don't have the ability to put my child in a different school. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a dance school or an art school or whatever. And I don't have the money for that. There's not one nearby, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just stop. Okay, maybe not, but now you do. And I think that's a great question to start asking is, how do I put myself or my child into a school that fits them instead of assuming that a good kid would fit at any school? or in any place or in any particular environment. And so that doesn't always happen. There's certainly times where people have done kind of the opposite. Before I tell you that story, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the show, which is not sponsored by. So I think we'll combine a couple things. We're continue to not be sponsored by Liquid Death Mountain Water. I'm not being paid to advertise them. But I will tell you, I have this in my outside refrigerator, and it's now one of my daughter's favorite things to take with her when we go on walks. It's summer in North Carolina. And even when we walk late in the day, she loves to grab one of these. I think it certainly makes the neighbors think that she's chugging a tall boy as she walks around the neighborhood. But she loves it. And then when I had my family over, my wife's family was over, and her sisters and her brother and their spouses and their children, all the adults were loving the Liquid Death mountain water. Nobody wanted a bottle of water. Everybody wanted to crack open a Liquid Death. And not only was I not encouraging it, I was actually, wanted to discourage it, because it's my favorite and it's my thing. And I'm trying to make sure I have one every time I'm on the podcast. So it was a big hit, and people were going out of their way to drink a Liquid Death. And it was also a conversation starter, because people kept going, "Hey, what are you drinking?" And everybody had to explain every time that it was actually, just flat, still water. They do have sparkling water. They have flavored drinks, but that's not what we were having. And so people were having a great time with it. So we're not sponsored by Liquid Death, but we're going to combine who else we're not sponsored by with the shoe of the day. So the shoe of the day is this sweet, sweet pink Nike Air Force One that's got two different colors of pink. It's even got pink on the sole. I customized these on Nike.com. They're one of my favorite new shoes. Super excited about them. But we are not sponsored by Nike. Joe Whale is collaborating with Nike, so in some ways he's a little bit sponsored by Nike, but I am not sponsored by Nike, not sponsored by Liquid Death Mountain Water. So people don't always want you to find your element. Everybody doesn't find their element. And sometimes people actively discourage. Remember, many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. So there was a guy named Paulo, and he wanted to be a writer. But his parents wanted him to be a doctor. And he said, "I want to be a writer." And they said, "We want you to be a doctor." He said, "We want you to be a writer." He said, "I want to be a writer." They said, "I want you to be a doctor." And they actually had him institutionalized. They sent him to a mental institution because they decided he was insane to pursue a career in writing when he should be a doctor, when that was the right course. They didn't just do it once, they did it multiple times, and even had them use electroshock therapy on him to try to basically drive these impulses out of him. Now, remember, I said this doesn't just happen at school, it also happens at home. So this is an example of parents stigmatizing his talent, brilliance, and creativity to the point of having him basically declared insane and having people actively try to stop him from becoming a writer. Fortunately for the world, they did not succeed. And Paulo went on to write some very best-selling books and become a tremendously successful author. I'm not always sure. I was going to look it up ahead of time. I'll say, let's see, Coelho. So Paulo Coelho, it's spelled Coelho. So I don't think I would have guessed that. It's Portuguese. Coelho. Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian lyricist and novelist. His best-selling novel was called The Alchemist, written in 1988. So he writes he writes an international bestseller. So it's easy to say, okay, like maybe the parents were right, or maybe this wasn't talent, brilliance, or creativity, and that's why there's always an ending to the story. Then Joe Wales starts to partner with Nike and sell sell his art in galleries, and starts to illustrate books and create his own coloring books. And Paulo went on to become, I mean, who even has a best-selling book, much less an international best-selling book? He became an incredibly famous author, not because somebody encouraged him to find his element, but even though someone discouraged him from finding his element. And that's to some extent how powerful these instincts could be, right? Remember, I said sometimes you're going to do this even if you're not getting paid. You're going to do what you love and what you're good at, even if you can't be rewarded for it or do it as a career. He did it even though his parents were physically and psychologically assaulting him for this desire. That's how powerful the desire was, to keep pursuing that, even in the face of those kinds of obstacles. So that's an example of fighting through barriers to find your element. It's also an extension of the quote, right? It's not just at school that people don't value our talent, brilliance, and creativity, or stigmatize it. It also happens at home. So let's contrast it again, right? Joe had a story of a teacher saying to stop, and a teacher saying, let me help you, a teacher saying this is bad, and a teacher saying that this is amazing. And Paulo had parents that said you need to stop, and took extreme measures to stop him. But there's another story that I love to tell about a guy named Thorkild Sohn. So Thorkild Sohn lives in Denmark, and he works in the software industry, and he has a son with autism. And two of the symptoms of autism are hyperfocus and doing the same thing over and over again. And so Thorkild Sohn's trying to be a good dad. He's trying to be a good parent. And so he's getting his son's support and therapy and assistance to basically help him be more normal, right? Autism is, in a sense, not being normal. People with autism don't have a normal level of eye contact with other people. They don't have a normal level of focus. They don't have a normal desire related to repetitive activities. They do a lot of things that are unusual, especially socially and interpersonally. And the theory of some is we have to stop that. We don't see talent, brilliance, and creativity in that autism. We see deviance, and that deviance needs to be fixed. And so Thorkild Sohn just trying to be a good dad, trying to get his son support and help to, in a sense, fix this disability of autism. But then things start to change, because Thorkild Sohn goes to work in software, and in software testing, a good software tester needs sort of two skills. They need to be able to hyper-focus, and they need to be able to do the same thing over and over again. And it turns out that typical people, neurotypical people, would be one of the ways to say it, can't hyper-focus and can't do the same thing over and over again, or they can't do it very well. And so in this moment, Thorkild Sohn reframed, we've talked about that a little bit before, reframed his son's autism, that hyperfocus and the desire to do the same things repetitively over and over again wasn't necessarily a negative. It could be a big positive in the right situation. So this is where it starts, right? Acceptance and appreciation. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast, acceptance and appreciation. But then what about alignment? We've been talking to this point about find the right fit, but sometimes you actually have to create the right fit. I didn't find the right fit. I didn't get hired for a job to become a professional speaker. I had to start my own business as a professional speaker. I had to start my own podcast. Somebody didn't hire me to be on their podcast, although I have been asked to be the guest on a lot of podcasts. I had to create the right fit for myself. I couldn't wait for somebody else to do it for me, or to some extent, nobody had created it for me. And that's what Thorkill Son did. Thorkill Son said, my son's autism isn't a weakness, it's a strength, but there's nobody out there hiring people with autism to do this work. So he started a company called Specialisterne. It means the specialist in Danish. And they only hire people with autism to do software testing. And his son's disability became a competitive advantage in the right situation. His weakness became a strength. His advantage became, or his disadvantage became an advantage. What seemed like a negative became a positive when the situation changed. Remember the first episode when we talked about Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer. So this is crucial. His dad didn't try to change who he was. He changed where he was. He didn't change the person. He changed the place. And in the right situation, his son's weaknesses started to look like strengths, right? Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not because the thing they were good at wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And when we see the value and when we stop stigmatizing it and we start embracing it and then actually amplifying it, that's what we call it the amplify assessment. That's why one of the key aspects of the freak factor is amplifying. His dad gave him a situation alignment where he could amplify instead of stop hyper focusing and stop doing the same thing over and over again. He said, keep hyper focusing and keep doing the same thing over and over again. It will actually get you paid for it. It will create a business around it. And that business has become so successful that it's served as a model for other businesses. For example, the global software giant SAP has now started to hire hundreds of people with autism from all over the world to do software testing for them because Thorkill Son showed them the strength that was hiding inside of the weakness, showing them the talent, the brilliance, and the creativity that had been stigmatized as autism or devalued or ignored inside of autism. His son has now found his element, but also hundreds and thousands of people with autism from all over the world have found their element because somebody created a situation. Didn't just say, well, where could we? I started my career finding job opportunities for people with developmental disabilities, but we also created some by starting our own businesses because businesses were not always open to, right, hiring people with disabilities. So one thing for your kids or for yourself is to say, how do we help you find the right fit? How do we help you find that school? How do we help you find that job? How do we help you find that career? How do I find the right school for me, the right study, the right field of study, the right industry to work in? But if we can't find it, we shouldn't give up. We should ask, is it possible to create it if it's not there? One of the guests I'd love to have on the show is Jason and Kim Katecki. Their books, a couple of their books are right behind me here. And they do a thing with their kids called unschooling, where they not only do homeschool, but they don't have a traditional curriculum. They're not going through math and science and reading in the traditional way. And they allow their kids to drive the process a lot more than you would in traditional schooling. And they see opportunities to learn in just about anything that happens. They're creating the right fit. And from a very young age, helping their kids to create environments that allow them to learn and grow and succeed. They're not waiting for someone else to sort of present the situation or saying, well, it's not out there, so I guess I just have to take a different path. And that's why I love the Specialisterne story. That's why I love the Thorkill Son story, because it actually raises the bar for us a little bit. Not only should we not be stigmatizing and devaluing the talent, brilliance, and creativity of other people, we should actually be going out of our way to find the upside, find the strength, identify the unique talents, brilliance, and creativity that people have, and then go even farther and help them find that element, right? Help them find that element. And those are such powerful stories. In fact, I was doing a presentation for one of my military clients. I work with military logistics officers in all of the branches of the military. And I was talking about this concept the other day, and I'd actually started rereading this book again. And one of the people in the audience brought it up and said that they'd read that story about Jillian, and they mixed up some of the details, but had it close enough, and it helped them reframe their relationship with their son who had autism, and they started looking for how to help their son with autism find his element instead of just fighting with him to try to succeed inside of the traditional school system. So this stuff is powerful, right? This stuff is powerful if we're willing to take on the challenge, but it will be a challenge. It isn't easy to find your element, but it also isn't impossible, which is why I told these stories. And you can do two things here. You can make sure that you're giving yourself permission. We've talked about that in the past to find your element, what you love and what you're good at. But also, hopefully, you're giving other people permission, or not even just giving them permission. It's one thing to say to your kid, sure, try to find the right fit, try to get out there and find your element. I hope you do. It's another thing to do like Thorkel Son and actually create that opportunity. It's another thing to be Joe's teacher and say, let's get you on Instagram. Let's get you out there. Let's start taking the first steps to help you find your element. So we started today with that question, are you in your element? And that's my goal for you. One of the reasons I'm doing this podcast, one of the reasons I do the Freak Factor is because it's been so fulfilling to me to live a life for the last, I guess, probably 20 years where I'm really in my element. When I started teaching, that was a little bit closer to being in my element. When I started the business and I was still teaching, that was a little bit closer to being in my element. When I was consulting, that was more in my element than when I was teaching. And then when I was training instead of consulting, I was more in my element. And then once I started doing keynote speeches, I was in my element almost to the max that it was possible. Although I've started doing a lot of emceeing lately, and doing speaker coaching. And I think all of those things, keynoting, emceeing, speaker coaching, are really me being in my element. I did a talk last week teaching people. I did a talk for 2,000 people. I thought, oh, it's a virtual talk. How many people will even show up? It was July 4th week, earlier in the week. And I thought, no one's going to show up for this. And I was in this same studio, except I was standing up because I tell people to do that when you're doing online presentations. And I was just fired up and waving my arms and shouting and hollering and getting all excited and passionate about how to communicate effectively with other people. And I have that opportunity now to share my passions and to help other people be more successful. And so that's the reason that I'm so passionate about this subject, because it's made such a huge difference in my life. It's enabled me to then help my wife to start her own interior design business. And when she's doing interior design, she's in her element. Help my daughters. I told you before, I have 3 different daughters and they've gone to 3 different high schools, and encourage them to find their element and watch them to do that and to have that freedom and have that permission, but also to be a resource for them, to encourage them to explore those kinds of things. And that's what I want for you. I want you to find your element. I want you to be moving closer to your element, but I also want you to be the kind of person who's helping other people to find their element, giving other people permission to find their element, which oftentimes goes together. If you think back to our interview with Colette, right? Oftentimes, if maybe I haven't been able to be authentic, I haven't been able to be myself, I haven't been able to do what I love and do what I do best, then I might not even want other people to have that opportunity because I haven't had that opportunity. And so maybe it feels a little better if you can kind of be miserable like me. And I certainly don't want to have to, watch you have this happiness and success. And that certainly is an instinct, right? Jealousy, envy. And so that's my passion, right? And maybe that's part of my element, right? Part of my element is helping other people find theirs and wanting to share that happiness and share that fulfillment. And that's why I do this podcast. And that's why I believe in it, because I have found it, right? And it's not easy. It's not easy to run my own business. It's not perfect. There's parts of it that certainly don't fit me. And there's ways around that. We'll talk about that. You partner with people. I'm partnering with my brother-in-law on this podcast. He has 20 years of experience in video and audio and in editing. And he's been a tremendous help to me. All I do is talk into this camera, and he showed me how to set it up, and he told me where to put the lights, and he tells me when I get off center, and he tells me when I'm not sitting in the right spot, and he tells me how to tweak it and to make it a little bit better. If I didn't have him, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, or I would have, got lost on the second episode and never got any farther. He's fixed my thumbnails. I was doing a terrible job with my thumbnails on YouTube. So every aspect of whatever you do doesn't have to be your element, but you also don't have to do the parts that take you out of your element, right? When we're out of our element, we're not as happy, we're not as successful. And so that's two things to talk about before we wrap it up to today. How do you know if you're in your element? So there's two main things to help you find, because maybe there's pieces of your current job, pieces of your current life where you're in your element. There's two main things, and it's time and energy, right? Time and energy. So time, let's do time first. How many of you have ever been in a situation where it felt like time was just going so slowly, right? You just wanted the work day to be over. You wanted the work week to be over. You wanted to get to that vacation. You wanted to get to the weekend, whatever it was. You wanted to get to lunch. You just wanted it to be over. And time just felt like it was going tremendously slowly. And every time you looked at the clock, it seemed like nothing was happening. That's almost always an indication that you're not in your element. And then we've almost all been in situations where the opposite occurs. It seems like time is just racing forward. When I do a speech, it just feels like I never have enough time. Not that I haven't planned it out, not that I don't know what I'm doing, but it seems like seconds are like minutes. It just seems like an hour goes tremendously quickly. When I look down and see that we've been doing this one for almost an hour, I don't feel the time that way, right? It seems like time is going very quickly. When you're in your element, time flies. You've heard the phrase, time flies when you're having fun. And that's actually true. And it's not just fun. It's when you're doing something that you love and you're doing something that you're good at. Part of being in the flow, if you've ever read that book by Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, which is a great book, and we'll probably talk about that. It's behind me, right? We'll talk about that at some point. One of the aspects of being in flow is time sort of disappears. You lose a sense of time, and time goes faster than it normally does. So one way to know that you're in your element is time. So start paying attention to that. When do I have that sensation of time going slowly? Keep track of those activities. When do I have that sensation of time flying? Keep track of those activities. And how can I, forget being in or not being in, be more in my element by gravitating more towards those activities that I love and I do well, where time flies, and less of those that I don't like and that I do poorly, where time does not do that. But the next one is energy, right? Not just how do I feel from a time standpoint, but what is doing these things do to my energy? When you're in flow, when you're in the zone, when you're in your element, you can actually be filled up by the activities that you're doing. You probably see that for me, over the course of this hour, my energy is not declining, right? And if anything, and especially when I did that presentation the other day and I was standing up and I was doing my presentation, but you see it with my hands, you feel it with my voice, you see it with my body language, my energy level is not decreasing during this presentation, during this podcast, because I love to do this and it's something that I do fairly well. So another thing to pay attention to is, when do I feel my energy draining? When do I feel sapped? I mean, people say, I feel like this job is sucking the life out of me. When do you feel like you don't even have the energy going into some activities, not because you haven't gotten a good night's sleep, not because you haven't had a good breakfast, but just because that activity, that meeting, talking to those people, working on that kind of a project, doing spreadsheets, doing that analysis, doing that. And here's the thing, you might think, well, everybody feels that way about that. No, there's somebody who's energized by the same thing that de-energizes you. Everybody has their element, and one man's trash is another man's treasure. So pay attention to the energy as well. And again, one concrete thing you can do here, just like tracking how your sense of time changes, track how your sense of how energetic you are. What are the activities that actually fill you up? Keep track of those. At work, what are the activities that drain you? And even if it's not at work, make sure you're doing activities that fill you up when you're not at work. right? So that you can come back to work and be stronger, even if your job isn't your element. Make sure that you're finding your element somewhere. And that's a point that Ken Robinson makes in the book, The Element. And I think it's a good one. You don't have to find your element at work. As long as you find your element and you have enough time to devote to that, to energize you, to fulfill you, to bring meaning to your life. It doesn't always have to be a paid sort of role or position, but you do need to make sure that your job doesn't sap you so much, drain you so much that you don't have any. Sometimes people say, oh, Dave, if I could do whatever I wanted, I'd just lay around and watch Netflix all day and take naps. That's probably because you're doing something that is not fulfilling, that is not enjoyable, that saps you, and you're trying to recover from that when you're not working. That isn't what you'd love to be doing. It's what you do as a reaction to what your job is actually doing to you. So two of the main clues, if you're looking, one of the other key parts of the freak factor start all the way at the beginning is awareness, assessment. That's another reason I created the Amplify assessment is if we don't know what our strengths and weaknesses are, if we don't know what those weakness strength combinations are, I call them defining features. If we don't know what fills us up and what empties us out, if we don't know what makes time fly and what makes time slow down for us, then we can't possibly find alignment. We can't possibly turn up the volume on those things because we don't know what those things are, right? So one great way that you can that anybody can do starting tomorrow, you don't even need to start tomorrow. You could start right now because you could just reflect back. When I'm at work, what saps me? When I'm at work, when does time seem to fly? When I'm at work, when does time seem to almost stop? When I'm at work, when am I energized and I could keep going and I don't need to take breaks and I don't need to have lunch and I don't need to stop and rest. I can just keep going because it's so perfect. It's so enjoyable. It's my element, right? It's my element. So the question we started with today is, are you in your element? I want you to be in your element. I, to some extent, have been able to find my element, and my passion is to help other people find theirs and encourage them that it's possible. And hopefully this podcast has done that. And again, if you've got questions about that, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to address some of those in future episodes. We actually had a comment come to me through Facebook where somebody's recently been diagnosed as an adult with autism. And so this podcast has been very helpful to them because we're reframing what seems like maybe, not a cancer diagnosis, certainly, but someone saying you've had this disability probably your whole life. We're diagnosing you with this disability. That's a lot to take on as an adult. And then here on The Imperfectionist, we're reframing autism as a difference, as neurodiversity, as potentially a powerful strength. In addition to the challenges that it creates, we're talking about the power of different with Gail Saltz in the first episode. And that's helping this person to manage that diagnosis, that surprise diagnosis, that potentially devastating diagnosis in a different way. So I really do appreciate your comments. I really do answer people's questions. So I went back and forth with that person. Certainly not going to give more information about that, protect their privacy. But that's been really helpful for someone who's going through that. And that's what we're trying to do. So if you have questions about getting in your element, finding your element, helping somebody else, maybe you're working with one of your children and they're struggling in school or struggling to find their element, I'd love to be helpful in that way as well. So that's what we started with. And then we used the quote, right, from Ken Robinson. Many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not because the thing they were good at wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. So part of this whole process is part of the imperfectionist role in this process is to help people see that those things that were stigmatized or not valued, those things that looked like weaknesses, are actually strengths. Those things that look like disadvantages are actually advantages. Those things that look like negatives were actually positive, and that we should value them and see them as valuable and not continue to see them as worthless. We should find that talent, that brilliance, and that creativity that's hiding inside of characteristics that we often stigmatized. And so If you need it to feel real, Joe Whale became Doodle Boy and partnered with Nike and the Prince and Princess of Wales, and has had tremendous success as still a child in school, because a teacher helped him to find his element. And Thorkill Sawn's son, and now this whole company and a whole movement, the Specialist Stern, is also a nonprofit foundation to support people with neurodiversity. Um, that's an example of doing it right. And Paulo fought through even significant resistance from his parents to become a famous and successful writer, because he knew that was his passion and it's what he loved, and what he was good at. People do find their element. Jillian's mom supported her. The psychiatrist supported her. They helped her to find the right school, and she went on to become famous and successful choreographer. She found her element, and she's admired by millions of people, and her work is appreciated by millions of people all over the world because someone invested in helping her to find her element. It's powerful, it's important, and it's very, very crucial. So this has been the Imperfectionist Podcast. I'm David Rendell. I am not sponsored by Nike, and I am not sponsored by Liquid Death Mountain Water. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that next time you listen to this podcast, you are able to say, Dave, I am at least one step closer to finding my element.